Chrysler was in deep trouble. The company was bleeding money, losing customers, and fighting just to survive. So, what did they do? They built a luxury coupe. The 1981 Chrysler Imperial was their comeback statement, a car meant to prove Chrysler could still compete with Cadillac and Lincoln. Lee Iacocca pushed for this car right after joining Chrysler. The plan was bold. One model, one price, loaded with futuristic technology. A flagship to prove the company still had fight left. From the outside, the Imperial looked crisp and formal. Hidden headlamps, a sharp roofline, and thicker body panels designed to resist dings. Chrysler even gave the paint extra attention to make the car feel special at first glance. Inside was where things got wild. The dashboard was fully digital. Glowing displays, an electronic information center, and buttons everywhere. For 1981, sitting in the Imperial felt like climbing into a spaceship. Then came the biggest gamble. Chrysler made electronic fuel injection standard on the 318 cubic inch V8. They called it continuous flow injection, claiming engineers from the NASA Apollo program helped develop it. A space-age engine for a space-age car. That is where everything collapsed. The fuel injection became a disaster. Owners could not keep it running. Dealers could not fix it. The technology was too new and too complex for the service network to handle. Chrysler eventually issued a recall and converted many cars back to carburetors. Ripping out your own signature technology tells you everything about how badly it failed. The digital dashboard caused its own problems. Those buttons and screens looked incredible in a brochure, but while driving, figuring out what controlled what felt like solving a puzzle at speed. The distracting layout contributed to the Imperial's vague steering feel. A luxury car should feel effortless. This one felt like a chore. Chrysler hoped to sell 25,000 Imperials per year. They built 7,225 in the first year. By 1983, production collapsed to just 1,427. Total production across 3 years barely reached 12,385. Frank Sinatra appeared in television commercials, selling one to Gregory Peck on camera. There was even a Frank Sinatra edition with special markings, but celebrity power could not fix what owners experienced every time they turned the key. Today, clean Imperials often sell for less than their original price. The digital dash fascinates certain collectors, but the fuel injection stigma still follows the car, keeping demand and values low. The Dodge Aspen arrived in 1976 with the kind of entrance most cars only dream about. It was named Car of the Year. Buyers rushed to dealerships. More than 500,000 Aspen and Volare models found homes in the first year. Dodge called the Aspen all new, wind tunnel tested, built from scratch. It was the modern American compact that felt big without being big. Something families could count on when fuel economy and value truly mattered. It came in every body style a family could need: coupe, sedan, and wagon. The trusted slant 6 engine sat under the hood as standard. V8 options gave it muscle when needed. Trim packages let buyers dress it up or keep things simple. On paper, the Aspen checked every box. Then reality showed up, and it showed up fast. The first major disaster was stalling. A carburetor seal could warp after contact with certain gasoline blends, cutting off fuel right when the driver hit the accelerator. Imagine merging into heavy traffic and the engine just quits. That nightmare happened to thousands of owners. The recall covered up to 1.3 million vehicles. The second problem was far scarier. A metal plate connecting the front suspension to the frame could crack from fatigue. If it broke during hard braking, the driver lost directional control instantly. No warning, no second chance. That recall covered up to 1.1 million vehicles. Then came the rust. The Aspen did not just corrode over time, it rusted with a vengeance. Early models developed gaping holes so quickly that the Federal Trade Commission stepped in. They pushed Chrysler toward a repair plan for 1977 and 1978 models. Some dealers quietly patched rusted panels while telling owners to keep quiet. When those practices were reported publicly, a car problem became a trust problem. Chrysler eventually added more factory rust protection and offered a 36-month anti-corrosion warranty. But the damage was done. The recall list kept growing. Hood latches, seatbelts that failed to lock, brake issues, and steering problems all piled on. Great idea, lousy execution. Over 5 years, Chrysler built 811,003 Aspens. Those numbers sound impressive until you realize how few survived. Rust destroyed most of them before they could become classics. Finding a solid Aspen today feels like searching for a car that never existed. The Chevrolet Vega was General Motors' bold answer to a growing question. Could America build a small car that truly competed with imports? In 1971, Automotive Press believed so. The Vega won Car of the Year honors. The press cheered. General Motors beamed with pride. The future of American small cars had arrived. General Motors built the Vega at a factory in Lordstown, Ohio. This was no ordinary assembly plant. Lordstown was designed for extreme speed and automation. Workers had seconds to complete each task before the line moved on. The company promoted this as cutting-edge manufacturing. But that speed created a disaster behind the scenes. Workers could not keep pace with the machines. Quality dropped. Frustration exploded into a strike that made national headlines. The Lordstown factory became as famous as the Vega itself, and for all the wrong reasons. The walkout reportedly cost General Motors a staggering amount in lost production. The engine told the Vega's real story. General Motors designed an aluminum block without traditional iron cylinder liners to save weight. In theory, brilliant engineering. In practice, the design left zero room for error. When problems appeared, and they appeared often, repairs that would be simple on other engines became nearly impossible on the Vega. Many mechanics treated them as throwaway motors. Fix it once, maybe. Fix it again? Scrap the whole thing. Then came the rust. The Vega became the poster child for 1970s American corrosion. The body was so rust-prone that metals seemed to dissolve almost immediately after exposure to moisture. In rainy or snowy regions, Vegas fell apart within a few seasons. Safety recalls hit early and hit hard. One major recall covered 526,000 vehicles for a terrifying rear axle defect. The axle shaft could separate, allowing the wheel to shift outward while the car dropped onto its rear suspension. This was not a rattle or a squeak. This was a car coming apart while rolling down the highway. General Motors produced over 2 million Vegas across 7 model years. Those massive numbers only amplified every failure. Every neighborhood had a Vega horror story, and none of them ended well. The car that won the highest automotive honor spent the rest of its life becoming a punchline. Today, clean survivors are genuinely rare. Most Vegas returned to the earth long ago, consumed by the very rust that wrote their story. The Cadillac Catera was born from desperation. By the late 1990s, Cadillac faced a problem no amount of chrome could solve. Their buyers were aging, and younger luxury shoppers walked straight past toward BMW, Lexus, and Mercedes. The brand needed a car that signaled reinvention. The Catera was supposed to deliver that. Here is the twist. The Catera was not really American. It was built in Germany by Opel, General Motors' European division, and classified as an import. Cadillac took a European platform, added luxury touches, and put their crest on the hood. European engineering would attract younger buyers who wanted driving excitement instead of floating comfort. Under the hood sat a 3-liter V6 making about 200 horsepower, paired with a 4-speed automatic. Early reviews were positive. The chassis felt balanced, tight, and refreshingly European. Then Cadillac launched the marketing campaign and everything went sideways. The slogan was, "The Caddy that zigs." The mascot was a cartoon duck inspired by heraldic bird figures in the Cadillac crest. An early advertisement featuring Cindy Crawford drew protests and was pulled. Some dealers complained the duck made the brand look foolish. The bigger failure was the target audience. Cadillac wanted young professionals. What they got were the same loyal, older buyers who always filled their showrooms. Reports showed the average Catera buyer was far older than the target demographic. The car built to attract new faces was being purchased by the familiar ones. Then reliability destroyed whatever goodwill remained. The Catera's dependability proved calamitous. Owners reported timing belt tensioner failures that shut engines down while driving. Cooling systems broke constantly. Repairs cost a fortune because parts came from Germany. Every mechanic visit reminded owners they had a luxury car with luxury-sized headaches. Cadillac set a first-year target of 25,000 sales and came close, moving around 23,000 units. Total production reached roughly 95,000 cars. In 2001, Cadillac quietly retired the Catera and replaced it with the CTS, a car that finally delivered on the promise the Catera never could. If this video changed how you see the cars we take for granted, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next one. Today, the Catera is nearly forgotten. Most did not survive because owners walked away once repair bills stacked too high. It drove well enough. It just could not stay out of the shop long enough for anyone to enjoy it. The Plymouth Volare shared its platform with the Dodge Aspen, and it shared every one of its problems too. Both cars launched as part of Chrysler's new compact line for 1976. Both won Car of the Year together, and both ended up buried under the same avalanche of recalls, rust, and broken trust. Plymouth sold the Volare as a modern family car built from the ground up. New styling, a comfortable ride, and enough room to carry a family. The Slant 6 came standard, while V8 options were available for those wanting more power. Early sales were massive. Chrysler moved nearly 700,000 Aspen and Volare models combined in 1977 alone. If you are enjoying this deep dive into automotive history, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss what is coming next. But behind those impressive figures, the Volare was falling apart. The same stalling defect that haunted the Aspen struck the Volare with equal force. A warped carburetor seal could cut fuel delivery without warning, leaving drivers stranded in intersections and merging lanes. The recall swept across a massive number of vehicles spanning both model lines. The suspension problem was identical. That front support plate could crack from metal fatigue, and if it failed during hard braking, the driver lost directional control instantly. No warning light, no gradual fade, just sudden loss of steering authority. Rust was the Volare's most visible wound. Chrysler's own heritage materials admit to serious corrosion on early cars. Fenders, rocker panels, and floor sections rotted so fast the factory scrambled to improve protection and launched a 36-month anti-corrosion warranty. But the cars already on the road were quietly decaying in driveways across the country. The scandal went deeper. Federal investigators pressured Chrysler into a rust repair program. It was also revealed that some dealers handled fixes quietly and discouraged owners from spreading the word. A quality failure became a betrayal. People did not just feel unlucky, they felt deceived. Plymouth produced roughly 1.07 million Volares across 5 model years. Sales peaked at 327,739 in 1977 and collapsed to just 90,063 by 1980. The word got out and buyers walked away. Today, a clean Volare is a rare find, not because Plymouth built so few, but because most could not survive their own flaws. Rust, recalls, and broken promises consumed them before they had a chance to become collector cars.